This is what I've presented to you all these years as my long and noisy prayer, as my magic trick. And like all good magic tricks, it begins with a setup.
At 76 years old, Bruce Springsteen still walks onto a stage like a man half his age. Yet the story behind that stamina is far heavier than most fans realize. Behind the legendary songs and marathon concerts sits a lifetime of quiet suffering. A father's untreated mental illness, his own decades-long battle with depression, the deaths of bandmates he considered brothers, and a wife who recently emerged from a years-long cancer battle. So what has this icon actually endured to become the boss the world thinks it knows? Stick around, because the real story of Bruce Springsteen is far sadder than any of his songs ever let on. A childhood haunted by darkness. Long before arenas and platinum records, there was a small, poorly heated house in Freehold, New Jersey, where a young Bruce Springsteen learned to read the moods of a father he could never quite reach. Douglas Springsteen worked a string of unstable blue-collar jobs and struggled with drinking, and only much later in life was he diagnosed with schizophrenia, paranoia, and depression. A history laid out in detail on Springsteen's own Wikipedia biography page. For decades, the family simply called it his temper, never realizing they were living alongside untreated mental illness. Springsteen has described sitting across from his father at the kitchen table, watching him drink in silence for hours, unsure whether the night would end in stony withdrawal or sudden rage. That tension left its mark early. He developed nervous tics as a child, earning the unfortunate nickname Blinky at school, a small but telling sign of how much pressure a boy could absorb simply by existing in that house. What makes the story more painful is how much of it repeated across generations. Springsteen has said that mental illness ran through his family long before his father carried it, describing relatives on his father's side who battled the same darkness without ever having a name for it. His paternal grandmother, who helped raise him, was described as obsessive and overwhelming in her own right, adding another layer of instability to an already fragile home. Even his own siblings grew up inside that same emotional weather system, though Bruce, as the oldest, absorbed much of it first. There is a particular cruelty in realizing, as an adult, that the chaos of childhood was never really about you at all. Springsteen has spoken about wishing his father had received real treatment decades earlier, imagining how different both of their lives might have looked, with proper care and an actual diagnosis instead of decades of guesswork. Instead, Douglas spent most of his working years undiagnosed, moving the family through a string of towns and jobs, while Bruce quietly absorbed the instability without any framework to understand it. By the time Bruce was a teenager, the emotional temperature at home had become almost unbearable. His parents eventually moved across the country to California when he was 19, hoping a change of scenery might lift what he later called the blackness in his father's mind. It did not fully work, but it did give Bruce something he desperately needed: distance. And with that distance came the first real space to begin building an identity separate from his father's shadow. He has said in interviews that he was essentially without a permanent home in those years, sleeping wherever a couch or a floor was offered while he chased a music career few people around him took seriously. None of this made it into the glossy version of the American rock and roll dream that most casual fans picture when they hear his name. Yet, it is impossible to separate the anthems about working-class struggle from the actual working-class household that shaped them. Before there was a stage, there was a boy trying to survive a home he could not control, and that survival instinct would follow him for the rest of his life. Money was tight throughout that childhood as well, and Springsteen has often described his upbringing as one shaped by the economic anxiety common to so many working families in post-war Freehold. He attended Catholic school for much of his early education, an experience he later described as rigid and occasionally frightening, adding yet another layer of pressure to a home life that already offered little in the way of comfort. Music became less a hobby and more an escape hatch, a place where the chaos at home could be temporarily rearranged into something that made sense. That childhood alone would be enough to explain a difficult adulthood, but for Bruce Springsteen, it was only the beginning of a much longer battle that fame never solved. The weight fame never lifted. Success is supposed to fix everything, Or at least that is the story people tell themselves about stardom. For Bruce Springsteen, worldwide fame, sold-out stadiums, and generational wealth did nothing to quiet the illness he had unknowingly inherited from his father. In his 2016 memoir, Born to Run, Springsteen revealed publicly for the first time that he had spent years in treatment for clinical depression, a disclosure that CBS News later described as one of the more startling admissions in the book, since he had spent decades performing as a picture of stability and grit. He wrote candidly about episodes that left him unable to function, describing one especially severe breakdown in his 60s that he now believes may have warranted hospitalization, even though he never actually checked himself in. When pressed on the details, he admitted he genuinely could not say how long that particular spell lasted, whether it stretched a few weeks or considerably longer, because depression has a way of distorting even the sufferer's own sense of time. That admission, made so publicly by a man built up as an emblem of American toughness, reframed how an entire generation of fans understood him. Springsteen has said, "The fear was never only about the depression itself. It was the terror of becoming his father, of somehow sliding into the same untreated darkness that had defined his childhood home." He described not knowing the parameters of his own illness, unsure whether he might eventually sink as low as Douglas once had. That fear pushed him toward therapy and medication long before it became common for public figures to speak openly about mental health treatment on this level of detail. His wife, Patty Scialfa, has played an outsized role in managing those episodes over the decades. By his own account, she became the one who could recognize the earliest signs of a downturn and gently steer him toward professional help before things spiraled further. It is a strikingly ordinary picture for a man whose stage persona radiates almost superhuman energy. A spouse quietly making sure medication gets taken and appointments get kept, year after year, tour after tour. What makes this part of his story land so hard is the contrast. Audiences watched him deliver 3-hour concerts loaded with sprints across the stage and guitar solos thrown into the crowd, all while privately managing an illness that can make simply getting out of bed feel impossible. Springsteen himself has suggested that the manic intensity of his live performances may be tied directly to the same insecurity that fueled his depression, a need to prove, night after night, that he was still enough for the people watching him. Long before Patty Scialfa became his steady anchor, Springsteen's first marriage told a very different story. He married actress Julianne Phillips in 1985 at the height of his Born in the USA fame, and the relationship ended in divorce just 4 years later, a period Springsteen has since acknowledged coincided with real emotional turmoil as he tried to reconcile enormous public success with private instability. Friends close to the band at the time have suggested the marriage struggled partly because Springsteen himself was still learning how to manage the same emotional volatility he had spent his childhood trying to escape. It would take his relationship with Scialfa, built gradually within the E Street Band itself, to give him a partner who understood both the music and the man behind it. Talking about it publicly did not cure anything, but it did something else entirely. It gave millions of fans permission to recognize the same struggle in themselves without shame. That alone reframes his legacy, not simply as a chronicler of factory towns and broken dreams, but as a man who lived his own version of that heartbreak long after the spotlight arrived and refused to leave. Even as he made peace with his own mind, however, the world kept taking pieces of the family he had built around him, starting with the band that had stood beside him since the very beginning. Losing the band that raised him. If Bruce Springsteen built a second family anywhere, it was inside the E Street Band, the group of musicians who backed him through 5 decades of recordings and tours. That family has not been spared from tragedy, and losing its members has hit Springsteen with a grief that fame could never soften. The first blow came in April 2008, when longtime keyboardist and accordion player Danny Federici died of melanoma at just 58 years old. Federici had performed with Springsteen since the earliest days of the band, contributing the swirling organ work that shaped songs across nearly every era of their catalog. His death arrived in the middle of an ongoing tour, and Springsteen chose to continue performing days later, telling audiences that playing on was the only way he knew how to grieve someone who had shared the stage with him for almost 40 years. Just 3 years after that loss, tragedy struck again in a way that shook the entire band far deeper. Saxophonist Clarence Clemons, known to fans simply as the Big Man, suffered a stroke at his Florida home in June 2011 and died from complications a week later at age 69, a loss that NPR covered at the time as the end of one of rock music's most recognizable creative partnerships. Clemons was far more than a session player. He was Springsteen's onstage foil and one of the most visually iconic figures in rock history, immortalized on the cover of Born to Run, standing shoulder to shoulder with Springsteen himself. Their partnership stretched back to Springsteen's earliest days performing in Asbury Park bars, decades before either man could have imagined stadiums full of fans chanting along to their songs. Springsteen later described Clemons as far more than a bandmate, calling their decades together a story that ran deeper than the music itself, a sentiment echoed on Clemons' own Wikipedia page, documenting their nearly 40 years of collaboration. Losing him left a void that the band spent years figuring out how to fill, eventually bringing in Clemons' nephew Jake to help carry the saxophone parts forward, a bittersweet solution that honored the original bond rather than replacing it outright. These were not distant industry acquaintances. They were men Springsteen had grown up alongside, argued with, forgiven, and built an entire creative identity beside for the better part of 40 years. Watching them go, first Federici and then Clemons, forced Springsteen to keep performing the very songs that once celebrated their shared youth, now doing so as one of the last original members left standing from that founding lineup. Adding to that sense of loss is the fact that the band itself once nearly disappeared altogether. Springsteen disbanded the original E Street lineup in 1989, choosing to record and tour with other musicians for almost a decade before reuniting with the classic group in 1999. That reunion tour became one of the most celebrated comebacks in rock history, but it also meant that when Federici and then Clemons passed away years later, the band was mourning men they had only recently found their way back to after a painful decade apart, making both losses sting with an added layer of regret over lost time. Grief of that magnitude does not simply pass once a tour resumes. It lingers in every performance of the songs those men helped create, a quiet reminder that survival, even for the boss, means continuing to sing about people who are no longer there to sing alongside him. And as if losing his musical family were not enough, the years since have brought an entirely new set of battles, this time involving his own body and the health of the woman who has stood beside him through everything. A body and a family under siege. By his 70s, Bruce Springsteen had already survived more emotional weight than most performers face in a lifetime. Yet the physical toll of aging on the road was only just beginning to show. In 2023, while touring with the E Street Band for the first time in 6 years, Springsteen was forced to postpone a string of shows after being diagnosed with peptic ulcer disease, a painful condition involving open sores in the stomach lining that Billboard reported eventually led to the cancellation of his entire remaining tour schedule for the year. What started as a handful of postponed September dates eventually grew into the loss of 14 remaining shows as doctors urged him to complete treatment before returning to the stage. For a performer whose identity has always been built around relentless physical stamina, being sidelined by his own body carried a different kind of heartbreak. The tour that had drawn some of the best reviews of his long career was suddenly interrupted, forcing a 74-year-old man who once treated 3-hour shows as a nightly ritual to admit, quite publicly, that his body needed rest. He eventually recovered and resumed touring in 2024. But the episode was a clear signal that the physical price of decades on stage had finally arrived. Then came a heartbreak far closer to home. Patti Scialfa, Springsteen's wife and longtime E Street Band guitarist, revealed in the 2024 documentary Road Diary that she had secretly been living with multiple myeloma since 2018, a rare blood cancer that NBC News explained develops in plasma cells and gradually compromises the immune system. She had kept the diagnosis private for years, quietly stepping back from full touring duty while fans speculated about her reduced stage presence never realizing she was managing a serious illness behind the scenes the entire time. Rolling Stone's reporting on the diagnosis noted that Scialfa chose to share her story publicly only once she felt ready, after years of managing it largely within her own family. Scialfa explained in the documentary that the condition forced her to be careful about where she went and what she exposed herself to, occasionally joining her husband for a song or two on stage as what she called a treat rather than a routine. For a couple who built their marriage and their band partnership around decades of touring together, that shift alone represented a quiet, private grief neither of them chose to broadcast until they were ready to control the story themselves. The story, thankfully, has taken a hopeful turn. In August 2026, Springsteen shared during a virtual appearance at Boston's Pan Mass Challenge fundraiser, an event covered by People, that Patty had finally reached remission after more than 8 years living with the disease, a moment he tied directly to the researchers and physicians at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute who supported her treatment throughout. He described medical research not as an abstract idea, but as something deeply personal, crediting the doctors and nurses who sat beside his family when hope felt hardest to find, and reminding his audience that ordinary people funding that research had helped save countless lives beyond just his own. Taken together, the ulcer diagnosis that interrupted his own tour and the years-long cancer battle his wife fought largely in private paint, a picture far removed from the invincible rock icon fans see under stadium lights. At 76, Bruce Springsteen is still recovering, still worrying, and still showing up. Not because the hardship has ended, but because showing up has always been the only response he has ever really known. So when people ask what has made Bruce Springsteen who he is today, the honest answer is not just the music, the awards, or the sold-out tours. It is a childhood shaped by a father's untreated illness, a private and lifelong fight against his own depression, the loss of the men who stood beside him on stage for decades, and a marriage now steadied by the relief of remission after years of silent worry. None of that fits neatly into a highlight reel, yet all of it explains why every performance he still gives at 76 carries the weight of a man who has survived far more than his songs ever let on. He built a career telling other people's stories of struggle and quiet endurance, never quite letting on that he was living one of his own the entire time, one show, one loss, and one recovery at a time. Even now, at 76, Springsteen continues adjusting his touring schedule to account for a body that can no longer promise the same recovery time it once did, spacing out dates and building in rest periods that would have seemed unthinkable to the man who once bragged about never missing a show. He has spoken about mortality more openly in recent years, describing a growing awareness that the time left to perform the songs he loves is no longer unlimited, a realization that has only made him more protective of the health crises still unfolding around him. That awareness, more than any single diagnosis, may be the clearest sign of just how much tragedy has quietly shaped the man still standing at the microphone every night. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.